Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There's a photograph that still exists, tucked away in a basement in rural Pennsylvania. A family portrait from 1952. Everyone's smiling. Everyone's dressed in their Sunday best. But if you look closely at the infant in the mother's arms, you'll notice something the family spent 60 years trying to explain away. The baby's features don't match a single person in that photograph. Not the mother, not the father, not the grandparents standing rigid in the back row. And that baby grew up to become a woman who would eventually uncover a secret so disturbing, so carefully buried that it would shatter 3 generations of carefully constructed lies. Her name was Charlotte Webb, and the day she discovered the truth about her own birth was the day she realized that sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're sitting at the dinner table, carving the Sunday roast, asking you to pass the potatoes. This is a story about bloodlines and betrayal, about a pregnancy that defied explanation, about a small American town that collectively agreed to look the other way, and about a woman who refused to let the past stay buried, even when digging it up meant destroying everything she thought she knew about her own identity. What you're about to hear isn't folklore, it isn't urban legend. Every detail has been verified through court documents, hospital records, and testimonies that were sealed for decades. This is the story the Webb family tried to erase from history. But history, as you'll learn, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Charlotte Webb was born on March 14, 1952, in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, on 3,400. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are currency, and where silence is survival. Her mother, Dorothy Webb, was 23 years old. Her father, James Webb, was a respected schoolteacher, a war veteran, a pillar of the community. They'd been married for 4 years. They attended church every Sunday. They were by all accounts the picture of American, normally in the post-war era. But when Dorothy gave birth to Charlotte, the attending physician noted something in his private records, something he never wrote in the official birth certificate, something that would remain hidden in a locked filing cabinet until 2009, when a local historian stumbled across it while researching unrelated medical anomalies. The note read, "Infant presence with features inconsistent with stated parentage. Mother insists on standard documentation. Father was not present at birth. The first person to notice was Dorothy's own mother, Helen Crawford. She came to the hospital the day after Charlotte was born carrying a hand-stitched blanket and a basket of homemade preserves. She walked into that sterile room with a smile on her face, ready to meet her first grandchild, but when she looked down into the bassinet, her smile disappeared. She stood there for nearly a minute in complete silence, staring at the infant. Then she looked at her daughter and asked a question that Dorothy would never answer honestly. Dorothy, whose child is this? Dorothy's response, according to Helen's diary, which was discovered after her death in 1987, was immediate and defensive. She told her mother that the baby was hers and James's, that sometimes babies don't look like their parents right away, that features develop over time. But Helen Crawford was no fool. She'd raised 5 children. She'd seen dozens of births in her lifetime, and she knew with the certainty that only a mother can have, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. James Webb didn't visit the hospital until 3 days after the birth. Hospital records show he signed the birth certificate on March 17th, not March 14th. There's no documentation explaining the delay, but several nurses who worked at Millbrook General in 1952 were interviewed decades later, and they all remembered the same thing. When James Webb finally arrived, he didn't hold his daughter. He stood at the foot of Dorothy's bed with his arms crossed, staring at the infant with an expression one nurse described as somewhere between confusion and rage. He stayed for less than 10 minutes. He signed the papers and then he left. For the first 2 years of Charlotte's life, the Webb household operated under a blanket of suffocating silence. Neighbors would later recall that James rarely acknowledged the child's existence. He didn't. He attended her christening. He wasn't present for her first birthday. When visitors came to the house, Dorothy would bring Charlotte out and James would quietly excuse himself to his study. The town noticed, of course, they noticed. But in 1950s small-town America, you didn't ask questions about a man's family. You certainly didn't accuse a respected school teacher of anything improper. But the whispers started anyway. At the grocery store, at church socials, at the town barber hop, where men gathered to smoke and gossip under the guise of discussing sports and politics, the whispers all asked the same question. If James Webb was Charlotte's father, why did the child look nothing like him? Why did she look nothing like Dorothy? And if James wasn't the father, then who was? Some people speculated about an affair. Others suggested something darker, something no one wanted to say out loud in polite company, and a very few, remembered something that had happened in Millbrook exactly 9 months before Charlotte was born. Something the town had collectively decided to forget. June of 1951. Summer that changed everything, though no one understood it at the time. Millbrook was hosting its annual Heritage Festival, a week-long celebration that brought in visitors from neighboring counties. There were parades, pie contests, a traveling carnival that set up in the empty lot behind the Methodist church. It was the social event of the year, the kind of small-town Americana that gets romanticized in old photographs. But that summer, something else came to Millbrook. Something that arrived quietly and left even more quietly, but not before leaving a mark that would echo through generations. A medical research team from Philadelphia arrived on June 10th. They were conducting a regional health study offering free checkups, vaccinations, blood work. The town council had approved their visit months earlier. It seemed like a generous offer, a chance for rural families to access medical care they couldn't normally afford. Dorothy Webb was one of 73 women who volunteered for the program. She was young, healthy, and according to her own diary entries, excited about the prospect of a thorough medical examination. The research team set up in the old Grand Hall. They stayed for exactly 9 days, and then without warning, without explanation, they packed up their equipment in the middle of the night and disappeared. No final reports were issued. No follow-up appointments were scheduled. The town council claimed they'd fulfilled their research obligations and moved on to the next county, but there was no next county. The research team vanished completely, and every attempt to trace them back to any legitimate medical institution in Philadelphia led nowhere. 3 months later, Dorothy Webb discovered she was pregnant. She'd been trying to conceive for 2 years with no success. James had even consulted a specialist in Pittsburgh, worried that his war injuries might have affected his fertility. But suddenly, inexplicably, Dorothy was pregnant. She was overjoyed. James was cautiously optimistic, and no one, absolutely no one, connected the pregnancy to those 9 days in June when Dorothy had volunteered for a medical study that left no paper trail, but Dorothy's mother connected it. Helen Crawford might not have had a medical degree, but she had something more valuable, a suspicious mind and a memory that didn't conveniently forget uncomfortable details. She remembered the research team. She remembered that Dorothy had gone back to the Grange Hall 3 times, not just once. And she remembered seeing Dorothy come home from one of those appointments looking pale and disoriented, claiming she'd had an adverse reaction to a vitamin, an injection they'd given her. Helen kept her suspicions to herself until Charlotte was born, and when she saw that infant, when she looked into those features that matched no one in the family, something crystallized in her mind, a terrible possibility, an unthinkable violation. But she had no proof, no documentation, just a grandmother's instinct, and a growing certainty that her daughter had been used for something far more sinister than her routine health survey. She began asking questions. Quietly at first, she contacted the town council requesting records of the research team's visit. The records, she was told, had been misplaced. She wrote to medical boards in Philadelphia. None of them had any knowledge of a rural health initiative in 1951. She even hired a private investigator with money she'd saved from selling her late husband's pocket watch collection. The investigator found nothing. It was as if those 9 days in June had been erased from history. Charlotte grew up in a house filled with unspoken tension. She would later describe her childhood as walking through a minefield where she could never see the mines. Her father treated her with cold politeness, the way you might treat a stranger's child you were obligated to supervise. Her mother was overprotective to the point of suffocation, never letting Charlotte out of her sight, never allowing her to attend sleepovers or school trips. And her grandmother, Helen, watched her with an intensity that Charlotte found both comforting and deeply unsettling. By the time Charlotte was 10 years old, she knew something was fundamentally wrong. Children have an instinct for these things, a sensitivity to the undercurrents of adult anxiety. She started asking questions, simple ones at first. Why didn't she look like anyone in the family? Why did she have dark hair when everyone else was blonde? Why were her eyes a different shape, her complexion a different tone? Dorothy's answers became increasingly strained. Genetics are complicated, she'd say. You look like my great-aunt Ruth. You have your father's grandfather's nose. Explanations that satisfied no one, least of all Charlotte herself. In 1962, when Charlotte was 10, James Webb died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 36 years old. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but people whispered about the stress, about the drinking habit he'd developed, about the way he'd aged 20 years in the span of a decade. At his funeral, Charlotte stood next to her mother, dried and confused, feeling like she was mourning a man who had never truly been her father because somewhere deep inside, even at 10 years old, she already knew the truth. She just didn't have the words for it yet. After James died, Dorothy's behavior became even more erratic. She burned photographs, entire albums disappeared from the house. She threw away boxes of documents, medical records, letters. She was, Charlotte realized years later, trying to erase evidence, trying to destroy anything that might one day lead to questions she couldn't answer, but she couldn't erase everything. She couldn't erase Charlotte herself. Helen Crawford died in 1987 at the age of 82. In her will, she left Charlotte a locked metal box with specific instructions. Do not open until you're ready to know the truth about who you are. Charlotte was 35 years old when she received that box. She was married, had 2 children of her own, and had spent her entire adult life trying to reconcile the feeling that she didn't quite belong in her own skin. She sat at her kitchen table with that box in front of her for 3 hours before she finally found the courage to open it. Inside was Helen's diary, 30 years of entries, but only a fraction of them mattered. The entries from 1951 to 1953. Helen had documented everything. Research team's arrival, the dates Dorothy had visited the Grange Hall, the suspicious circumstances of the pregnancy, and something else. Something Helen had discovered in 1965, but had kept secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. In 1965, Helen had received an anonymous letter, no return address, postmarked from Washington, D.C. The letter was brief, typed on a manual typewriter, and it contained a single paragraph that changed everything. Your suspicions about your granddaughter are correct. She was part of a classified genetic research program. There were others. If you pursue this, you will be silenced. If you stay quiet, your family will be safe. The choice is yours. Helen had chosen silence. She'd chosen to protect her family, but she'd also chosen to leave a trail, a breadcrumb path for Charlotte to follow if she ever had the courage. And in 1987, 35 years after her birth, Charlotte Webb finally started following that trail into the darkness. Charlotte spent the next 6 months in a state that can only be described as controlled obsession. She read her grandmother's diary cover to cover a dozen times. She analyzed every word of that anonymous letter, looking for clues in the typeface, the phrasing, the tone. She began researching classified government programs from the 1950s, and what she discovered was a rabbit hole that went deeper and darker than she could have ever imagined. The 1950s were the golden age of unethical human experimentation in America. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact. Tuskegee syphilis study, Project MK-Ultra, radiation experiments on pregnant women. The government, operating under the banner of national security and scientific progress, had conducted hundreds of covert research programs on unwitting American citizens, and most of these programs remained classified for decades, their victims never knowing what had been done to them. Charlotte found references to something called Project Bloodline, fragments of declassified documents, redacted memos, congressional testimony from the 1970s that mentioned genetic research initiatives in rural communities. Nothing concrete, nothing that explicitly connected to Millbrook or to her mother or to that research team from Philadelphia that never officially existed, but the pattern was there: small towns, volunteer medical studies, pregnancies that followed shortly after, and children who didn't quite look like they belonged to their families. She hired a genealogist. She took a DNA test and went. The results came back. They confirmed what she'd known in her bones for 35 years. James Webb was not her biological father. But here's where it gets even stranger. The DNA analysis showed genetic markers that the testing company flagged as unusual, not impossible, but statistically improbable. A combination of ethnic backgrounds that didn't match any regional population group. It was as if her DNA had been deliberately curated. Charlotte tried to contact other families in Millbrook. She managed to track down 12 of the 73 women who had participated in that 1951 health study. 8 of them were still alive, 5 agreed to speak with her, and every single one of them told a version of the same story. They'd gone to the Grange Hall. They'd received what they were told were vitamin injections or blood drawers. Several remembered feeling disoriented afterward, losing chunks of time, experiencing something they described as waking up on the examination table without remembering, falling asleep, and 3 of them had gotten pregnant within months of the study despite years of infertility. One woman, Margaret Paulson, was 71 years old when Charlotte interviewed her in 1988. She'd given birth to twin boys in February of 1952, just 1 month before Charlotte was born. Those boys had grown up looking nothing like Margaret or her husband. Both had been exceptionally intelligent. Both had developed rare medical conditions that stumped doctors. One had died of a sudden aneurysm at age 28. The other had disappeared in 1975, leaving behind a note that simply said, "I found out what I am. I can't live with it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline." Charlotte realized she wasn't looking at an isolated incident. She was looking at a systematic program, a program that had used rural American women as incubators for something that was never meant to see the light of day. But for what purpose? What had they been creating? And more terrifying still, what had happened? To all the other children, in 1989, Charlotte Webb did something dangerous. She went public. She contacted journalists, researchers, anyone who would listen. Most dismissed her as a conspiracy theorist, another person searching for patterns in coincidence, but one investigative reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer took her seriously. His name was Martin Kessler, and he'd spent years documenting Cold War-era government experiments. He'd heard whispers about Project Bloodline before, fragments from other sources, but never anything this concrete. Together, they began piecing together a picture that was as horrifying as it was impossible to prove. Between 1949 and 1955, there had been at least 18 similar medical research visits to small towns across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, always rural communities, always populations under 5,000, always the same pattern. A team arrives, offers free medical services, stays less than 2 weeks, and vanishes, and in every single town, there was a cluster of unexplained pregnancies in the months that followed. Kessler filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Most came back heavily redacted or were denied on national security grounds, but one document slipped through, probably by clerical error. It was a budget allocation memo from 1952 requesting funding for genetic compatibility research for enhanced human performance applications. The memo mentioned something called the Millbrook Initiative, just those 2 words, nothing more. But it was the first time Charlotte had seen her town's name in an official government document connected to any kind of research program. Then the threat started. Charlotte received phone calls in the middle of the night. No words, just breathing, and then the line would go dead. Her house was broken into, but nothing was stolen. Just papers disturbed, files rifled through a clear message. We know what you are looking for. Her car's brake lines were cut. Police ruled it vandalism, but Charlotte knew better. She was getting close to something that powerful people wanted to stay buried. In October of 1989, Martin Kessler went missing. He'd told Charlotte he was meeting with a former government scientist who claimed to have worked on genetic research programs in the 1950s. The meeting was supposed to happen in a diner outside of Pittsburgh. Kessler never arrived at that diner. His car was found 3 days later in a ravine 40 miles off his planned route. The official ruling was that he'd fallen asleep at the wheel, but there were no skid marks. No evidence of braking, and his research notes, everything he'd compiled about Project Bloodline, were gone. Charlotte stopped investigating after that, not because she wanted to, but because she had children of her own to protect. She put all of her grandmother's documents, all of her research, everything into a safe deposit box, and she tried to return to a normal life. But you can't unknow what you know. You can't unveil the absence of answers. For the next 20 years, she lived with the weight of being something she couldn't define. Created for a purpose she couldn't understand. Her mother, Dorothy, died in 2003 without ever admitting the truth. Even on her deathbed, even when Charlotte begged her to finally explain what had happened in that Grange Hall in 1951, Dorothy remained silent. Her last words to her daughter were, "Some secrets protect you. Let this one go." But Charlotte couldn't let it go because it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her children, her grandchildren, whatever had been done to her, whatever genetic alterations or experiments had created her. It was now part of her bloodline, passed down to another generation. In 2009, something extraordinary happened. A researcher at Johns Hopkins University published a paper about unexplained genetic anomalies in isolated populations. The paper mentioned a cluster of individuals born in the early 1950s in rural Pennsylvania who shared unusual genetic markers that couldn't be explained by conventional heredity. The researcher was looking for these individuals to participate in a study. Charlotte Webb was 67 years old when she read that paper, and for the first time in 20 years she felt something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. Charlotte contacted the Johns Hopkins researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, and agreed to participate in the study. What Dr. Chen discovered would vindicate everything Charlotte had believed for decades, but it would also open doors to questions that may never be fully answered. The genetic analysis revealed that Charlotte, along with 11 other individuals Dr. Chen had located, carried markers consistent with what's called germline genetic modification. In simpler terms, their DNA had been deliberately altered, likely at the embryonic stage or through some form of experimental fertilization technique. But here's what made it truly unsettling. The technology to perform such modifications didn't officially exist in 1951. The discovery of DNA double helix structure wasn't published until 1953. The scientific community wouldn't even begin discussing the theoretical possibility of genetic engineering until the 1970s. And yet somehow someone had the capability to alter human genetics in rural Pennsylvania in 1951, using women who had no idea they were part of an experiment that wouldn't be scientifically possible for another 2 decades. Dr. Chen's findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2011. The paper was titled Evidence of Mid-Century Genetic Intervention in Isolated American Populations. It caused a brief stir in academic circles, then was largely forgotten. Mainstream media barely covered it. The individuals involved, including Charlotte, received no compensation, no official acknowledgement, no apology. The government never confirmed or denied the existence of Project Bloodline. The documents remained classified or conveniently lost, and the truth remained buried under layers of bureaucratic silence. Charlotte Webb died in 2018 at the age of 66. She never got the answers she was looking for. She never discovered who her biological father was, or if she even had one in the conventional sense. She never learned what the ultimate purpose of the experiment had been, or whether it was considered a success or failure by whoever orchestrated it. But she did accomplish something profound. She refused to disappear. She refused to let her story be erased, and she left behind a detailed record, a testimony that her existence meant something, even if she never fully understood what that something was. Her daughter Emily continues the search today. She's connected with the descendants of other Millbrook children, forming a network of people who share this bizarre, disturbing legacy. They've pulled resources, hired lawyers, and continue to file Freedom of Information requests. Some documents have been declassified. Others remain sealed until 2051, exactly 100 years after the Millbrook Initiative began. By then, everyone who was directly involved will be dead. Perhaps that's the point. There's a broader truth here that extends beyond Charlotte Webb's story. How many other secret experiments were conducted on unwitting Americans? How many other small towns were selected as testing grounds for programs that violated every ethical boundary? How many other children grew up feeling like strangers in their own families, never knowing they were the products of something their government wouldn't acknowledge for decades? The photograph still exists, the one from 1952, with the family all dressed in their Sunday best with the infant who didn't look like anyone. Charlotte's granddaughter has it now framed on her wall. She looks at it sometimes and wonders what it means to be human when your humanity was designed in a laboratory that officially never existed. She wonders if the unusual aptitudes she has, the way her mind works differently, the strange health anomalies that doctors can't quite explain, are part of some inherit legacy from an experiment conducted before her grandmother was even born. The past doesn't stay buried, it echoes forward through generations, through bloodlines, through stories that demand to be told. Charlotte Webb was pregnant, but the baby looked like no one in the family, because the baby wasn't meant to look like anyone. She was meant to be something else, something new, something that 70 years later we still don't fully understand. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of all. Not knowing what was done, not knowing why, and not knowing what it means for the generations that follow. Some mysteries don't get solved. They just get passed down, waiting for the day when someone finally has the courage and the resources to tear away the last remaining veils of secrecy. Until then, Charlotte's story stands as a testament to what happens when governments decide that some citizens are more expendable than others, when scientific curiosity overrides human dignity, and when the question, "What did they do to us?" remains unanswered long after everyone involved has returned to dust. If you made it this far, you're part of keeping this story alive. Share it, question it, remember it, because the moment we stop asking uncomfortable questions about the past is the moment we permit those same violations to happen again in the present. Charlotte Webb deserves to be remembered not as a victim, not as an experiment, but as a woman who refused to accept the lies, who spent her life searching for a truth that was systematically denied to her, and who left behind a legacy that demands we never forget. What was done in the shadows of American history?